Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome to, what are we in, week 5, I think now. We're really moving along here. So far in this class, we've spent a lot of time talking about political history, and we've spent a lot of time talking about intellectual history, things like the Enlightenment and all of these new political ideologies in the post-revolution era. And we spent a bit of time talking about cultural history too. And by cultural history, what I mean is um, the sort of art and the aesthetics of European life in the early 19th century. And we've talked about that through Romanticism. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to take a slightly different approach to thinking about the past. And we're going to consider significant economic and social transformations that were taking place throughout the very long period that we've already discussed, from about 1700 up to the middle of the 19th century. But the events that we're talking about today really, they didn't end in the 19th century, and they're still unfolding in the world today. And the very broad term that we're going to use to describe these transformations is the Industrial Revolution. And I'm sure all of you, or almost all of you, have heard that term before. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about a period of very rapid but very sustained economic growth, right? It's economic growth without precedent in all of human history. It really takes off and begins in the 1760s and 1770s in England. Although there are some scholars who say that they see the traces of the Industrial Revolution way back in the 17th century. But for our purposes, really takes off in the second half of the 18th century, second half of the 1700s, and then continues apace throughout the 20th century. That's the 1900s, and in many parts of the world is still continuing here into the 21st century. It's a worldwide phenomenon, but like I said, it occurs at different times depending on place. It occurs at different rates depending on place, like how quickly a place industrializes is not necessarily the same everywhere. But it developed earliest and it developed most quickly in England. So we've got two questions for this early part of today's lecture. First, what was so revolutionary about the Industrial Revolution? What actually changed? And second, why England, right? Why not Russia? Why not France? Why not China? Why not India? Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in England? And we've read a document this week that offers a few thoughts about that issue, and I'm going to offer a few more. Okay. So, and sorry for the pixelated nature of that image. I swear it looked better before, but you get the idea. So this question of why England is really, it's a vexing, problematic issue, because until the late 18th century, right, until England made its big break around the 1760s, 1770s, England did not significantly differ from other regions of Europe. It did not significantly differ from India. It did not significantly differ from Southwest China in most key economic indicators, right? In terms of population growth, the scale and the reach of business, the per capita levels of consumption, life expectancy, right? The best historical work has suggested that all of these places were more or less running alongside one another. And then the Industrial Revolution marks this kind of pivotal breaking point. I'm going to give you 4 explanations for why England broke away. The document that you read this week offers like a dozen. Scholars have pointed to an endless number of things that could explain this, but I think there are 4 very essential ones. And as I list them, I'm not listing them in order of priority. Okay. In fact, I would say, as we go, I'll point out the 2 that I think are really most important. So here we go. Sorry about that. So the first advantage was political. despite the American Revolution, Britain was, compared to other countries, especially in Europe, very politically stable throughout the 18th century. The same regime that governed Britain since the late 17th century, since the late 1600s, was still governing it throughout the Industrial Revolution, right? They had their constitutional monarchy, and it was this very strong, very stable form of government. So that means that there's not the kind of abrupt, cataclysmic political shocks that you see happening in, say, France, right? Or that you see happening in Austria or Russia. The second advantage was environmental. Britain had enormous deposits of coal and iron. And until this point in human history, societies really depended on biofuels, not fossil fuels, right? So biofuels, that's, of course, human and animal labor, people and animals actually creating the force to drive something, but also things like wood or peat, right? So that's plant-based sources of power. With its massive coal deposits, however, England could generate a ton of power without denuding forests, right? Without deforestation. It could transport fuel very easily because coal is far more compact than wood, right? We all know that. And it can develop new technologies that are based on coal power, in particular steam engines, right? So coal means speed, it means power, it means heat, and it means energy in a very contained, very efficient source. Wood power could not possibly compete with that. Wood power could not generate an industrial revolution, but coal power could. The third advantage was Britain's approach to colonialism. Okay, so we've discussed this a little bit here and there, but I want to dive in just a little bit more right now. Throughout the 18th century, the British economy was expanding, right? Britain was in near constant war with France. There's a constant phase of conquest in the New World. And there are all of these treaties that they're writing. And the result of all of this is a global empire by the end of the 18th century. Colonization, though, it wasn't like a haphazard process of acquiring land and just saying like, oh, we got more land, we got more land, we got more land. Great, great, right? It's actually very strategic. It means acquiring access to key resources that can grow the economy. And it means opening up new markets, right? Finding places that are outside of your home country that you can sell things to, right? People who will buy your stuff. The key issue here is that Britain organized its empire in such a way that its markets had no choice but to do business only with the home country, right? This is one of the founding problems for American revolutionaries, and one of the reasons that they have their uprising. But Britain's colonies extend far beyond those 13 in North America. The other key issue in the way Britain organized its colonies was that it relied largely, in many cases almost exclusively, on slave labor. Okay, so the British Empire has destroyed and removed native populations from many places, particularly throughout the Caribbean. And it has replaced native populations with enslaved Africans. Okay, and then enslaved Africans have no choice but to produce essential resources that will then go back to the home country. What are those resources? There's sugar, which is truly essential. Sugar, in a sense, is almost like coal. It's a very compact and very efficient way to consume calories, right? But there's also things like tobacco. From northern North America, there's things like furs and lumber. There's fish. There's silver, which is really important for building up the monetary supply. And then at the same time, the home country is able to sell its goods to all of these colonies that need them because they don't produce anything other than those staple commodities, right? So if you have a sugar producing island in the Caribbean, they have no source of food because everything that they produce is going back to the home country, and all of the land is devoted to cultivating sugar, right? So they need food, they need clothing, and England is able to sell all of that to them. This trade is insanely lucrative. It's 10 times more lucrative by the 1770s than by 1700, right? So Britain is building an enslaved empire that is bringing a vast amount of money back to the home country, and is also making goods just cheaper and cheaper all the time. And I really want to emphasize here, none of this could have worked without slavery. Britain needed, in order to sustain its economic growth, it needed constant supply of cheap goods, and it could not have had access to those goods if workers had a choice, right? This is something that scholars have pointed out, right? That there are regions in Southwest China that also have colonies, but those colonies have free labor, which means that workers are able to leave. They're able to go somewhere else. They're able to take care of their own needs. Enslaved people were not able to take care of their own needs. They have no choice but to work and to die for the production of British sugar, right? They have to be violently coerced into the work. They also die very quickly. They have extremely short life expectancies, which, and this is an extremely grim thing to point out, is very lucrative for Britain, because that means it can also create a trade in enslaved people. And so the empire is constantly moving humans away from West Africa and into the Caribbean and selling them as it does, profiting on those sales, profiting on the labor of those people, and then replacing those people sort of constantly with new slaves, right? One way to think about this is, and this is sort of a way that economic historians describe a relationship like this, Britain is a core. It's a core economy, right? It's at the center of a huge network of trade. And the Caribbean is at the periphery, right? And the periphery is dependent on the core. The periphery only exists doing the thing that it does, right? Having enslaved people produce sugar, because the core demands it and the core supports it, okay? So that core and periphery relationship is essential to how Britain organizes its global empire. Why does this matter for industrialism? Well, it's making Britain very rich. And as Britain gets rich, British people can focus less of their time, at least some British people can focus less of their time on worrying about producing their own food, right? And they can focus more of their time on things like technological development, on inventions, right? Okay, so that's labor in the colonies, right? Slave labor. But what about labor at home, right? An industrial economy needs people to work within it, work within its factories, for example. Industrial labor is not fun. You're not going to just encourage someone to come and work in your factory because they're going to have a great time and they're going to get paid a lot and life is going to be good, right? That's actually not how people think about this at all. People don't want to go and work in factories. You do it because there's no other option for your survival. So how does Britain create a large enough population of people who have no choice but to come and work in the factory? Well, they do it very effectively, and this is a fourth advantage. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy elites in Britain, nobles, they started building a lot of fences, and they started growing what are called hedgerows, which are essentially like natural fences, all over the countryside. You can see some, this image is from Cumbria in the north of England. And if you look at the bottom here, you can see these stone barricades essentially all across the landscape. It sort of looks like if you fly over the plains or the Midwest in the United States, you notice that the land is so heavily squared off, right? It's all, and people's private property is sort of heavily designated by roads and by fences, etc. And then you can also see this runs up the mountainside. It almost looks like Forest Service roads in Montana, right? This is evidence of a 17th and 18th century process called enclosure. An enclosure was essentially the process of making property private, property that had once been commonly held, that all people had access to, and blocking it off so that people don't have access to that property anymore, right? In the common property era, people could graze their own animals on the land. They might be able to raise some of their own food on the land. They might be able to extract some resource from the food, perhaps like a fruit or something like that. They could fell trees for firewood. They could hunt game. In other words, common people could live off of the land and sustain their lives that way. But once these enclosures begin popping up, right, common people no longer have access to this land at the bottom of this image, right? That's blocked off. They can't enter into that private property without endangering themselves. It's no longer available to them. What does that mean? It means that ordinary people no longer have access to the way that they once survived, right? The ways that they sustained themselves have been blocked from them. So they have to find another way to survive. One of the ways they do this is by trying to get to the colonies, to a place like Virginia, indenture themselves as workers to a wealthy person in North America, and try to make a living that way. An even more common way that they try to survive though is they start moving into cities. Okay, they become, in effect, this very cheap source of labor. Okay, there are people who have to sell themselves. They have to sell their time to a factory owner because they have no other option. Right? If they don't earn money working in a factory, they won't survive. Okay, so that's how you build a capitalist labor class, or a labor class within a capitalist society, an industrial society, is you block off all other options for survival, and then someone's going to come and want to make their money. But before that, people would rather sustain themselves in the ways that they always have, right? Okay, so those are some advantages that England has, right? Political stability, access to coal, access to an empire of slavery, and a very desperate domestic labor supply that has no choice but to come and work in factories. It's a process of enclosure. So what did industrialization actually look like, right? We know that there's these preconditions for industrialization. What in practice was it like for people's everyday lives? How did things change? Another way of asking this is, what did Britain do with its advantages? There's a couple of key components that make a society industrial, that make an industrial society different than a pre-industrial society. One of those components is technology, right? Drawing on the wealth produced by colonial trade, as I said just a few minutes ago, British inventors and scientists and businessmen were able to devise technology that could move goods more quickly, or could produce goods more quickly and uniformly. We read Adam Smith this week, and he's talking about the division of labor. The division of labor is itself a technology, and it depends on technology that can simplify tasks. To make a pin, you no longer need to be a pin craftsperson who's mastered every step. You just need to do this one rote step, run a machine, and you've accomplished your small task of making the pin, right? Consider as well the manufacture of thread, right? Making thread, making fabric is really the core task of the industrial economy in England, right? It's manufacturing cotton into cheap, comfortable fabric. But under the old system, the way this was done before the Industrial Revolution, raw cotton or wool was spun by hand into a thread, into a yarn that could then be handed over to a weaver to finish goods. This was incredibly laborious. It was mostly, or actually it was entirely done in individual homes, right? People would do this in their living room and then they would sell it outside the house, okay? It was totally decentralized. So you could have, if you imagine Missoula, 1,000 different homes in Missoula, all manufacturing one piece of a product and then trying to sell it off to somebody who would come around and buy it, which means everything that people are making is going to be slightly different. They're going to be working on different timetables. They're going to have different kind of self-discipline in their production of the thread. So it's sort of haphazard, right? Technology makes all this more efficient, right? In the final quarter of the 18th century, this is the hand spinning, by the way. And as you can see, look, the person, she is in her own home. She's near the fireplace. She's got her pet there. She's working out of the house, spinning quite slowly by hand. In the 18th century, late 18th century, inventors are producing or sort of rapidly producing a series of labor-saving technologies. At first, these technologies, this is a spinning jenny, they work by hand, but they make hand production more efficient. But eventually they start to rely on other sources of energy, non-human sources of energy, okay? There's using water, then using horses, and then eventually using coal to produce hundreds and hundreds of times more thread, more fabric than their predecessor technologies can, even in a single day. Okay. Why does any of that matter? These technologies produce, for one, better and more consistent products, right? You're going to get stronger thread. You're going to get very uniform thread. And you're going to get a lot more of it than was ever possible before. Cotton goods, when you have much more material and it's much more predictable how much you're going to have, that reduces the cost of business, which means cotton goods by the end of the 18th century are 20 times cheaper than they were even 25 years earlier, right? When people were making all this stuff in their own homes. So clothing is cheaper, it's more comfortable, it's more widely available than ever before. And Britain, as the center of manufacturing in these goods, becomes incredibly powerful. It becomes an industrial powerhouse because other places in the world want these goods and they're willing to pay for them. Okay, so that technology enables this to happen. Technology also allows a second characteristic of industrialization to emerge, and that's the centralization of production, right? No longer is thread or cloth going to be manufactured in individual homes and then sold to a broker, right? Instead, workers are going to come into a centralized location and work on much larger machines, right? These machines are big, they're heavy, they need to be housed in factories. And none of this is really possible without large businesses who have access to capital, right? Capital is, what I mean by that is just assets, wealth, right? That could be money, it could be property. Folks who have a lot of capital can bring that capital together and they can create something that individually they may not have been able to, right? Like a huge factory that contains many expensive machines and can pay hundreds or thousands of people to come into the factory and work those machines. Right? What does that mean? It means that cities begin developing very quickly around factory production, okay? So we're a long way now from individuals in their homes in the village producing thread. Now we have factories producing thread and thousands of people living around them and coming into them every day to work, right? Men and women, as I mentioned before, they'd been driven from home by enclosure. They have little choice but to work in the factories, and they have very little choice but to live in the cities near the factories. So imagine a city like Manchester, okay? In 1750, Manchester was a fairly sizable city. It had 20,000 people. By 1850, a century later, it had 400,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in Europe. And most of the people who lived there were working in the city's sprawling factories, right? I think you're probably beginning to get a sense of why this is called a revolution. These are transformations in the pattern of work. They're transformations in the location of work and the location of everyday life. If you even just imagine one person whose parents lived in the countryside, whose parents were able to graze animals and more or less live from the land, and then in this person's own life, they live in a place like Manchester and they work in a factory. Just imagine that enormous shift in the expectations of daily life, in the rigor of daily life, in in the values that you have in daily life. Your everyday experiences are just completely different, right? It's almost like being picked up from one planet and dropped on another. That's how profound the change of the Industrial Revolution felt to people. Okay. Let's see. Then that's a picture of Manchester, right? I mean, if you go back, compare that image to that in Cumbria, right? And perhaps this isn't necessarily a fair comparison because that's such a majestic and beautiful photo. But you can see enclosure removes people from this landscape and eventually deposits them in this one. That's a pretty profound change. That's a pretty profound change. And as you can imagine, there are social and political consequences to all of this, right? People don't just have their lives upended and move into an industrial world and say, okay, this is it. We're here now. They have something to say about it, right? And they resent, particularly, the class of people who've put them in this position, and they resent the technology that they see as responsible for them being in this position. A number of people, this is especially in the late 1700s and into the early 1900s, they are enraged by the power of technology and they begin smashing machines. They begin destroying these spinning machines that have uprooted their lives. These machine breakers, they claim to follow a Robin Hood-like figure named Ned Ludd, L-U-D-D, or Captain Ludd. And so they called themselves the Luddites, right? And you may have heard that term, as Luddites are people who are afraid of technology and technological change. And we often use that term as a sort of diminutive. It's sort of an insult in our technology-obsessed society today, although I'm not so sure that it should be. Luddites believed in the 19th century, and I think they believed this very rightfully, that machines represented a threat to their personal well-being, right? Life as they wanted to live it was not going to be possible in this world of machines. And so they destroyed the machines. Now, it wasn't the machines per se, but the effect the machines had on their lives that Luddites resented. But they are an example of this broader social consequence of industrialization, right? And what what's happening here is we're seeing the making of a new class of people, right? The people who have been moved off the land by enclosure, the people who have ended up in cities and in factories, they're becoming their own class, a specific social class. And they are what we could call the working class. What do I mean when I say class? That's a term that gets thrown around a lot. Undoubtedly, everybody has encountered that term. I'm sure all of you imagine yourselves as members of one social class or another. And if you don't, spend some time thinking about it and try and figure out what class you do belong to. It can be hard sometimes in American life. Figure it out. Our boundaries get a little blurry. But class is basically a group identity that is both social and, very critically, economic. Right? The defining features of a class identity are based on the work that someone does, the amount they are paid for doing that work, or if they are paid for doing that work, and where they live in relation to their work. Okay. Do they live in a dormitory connected to the factory? Do they live on a sugar plantation? Do they live several miles away from an office? And do they have to commute into the office? Or do they live out in the countryside and profit from a factory but never actually have to go and see it? The awareness that one belongs to a class, right? The recognition that, oh, geez, I am a member of this working class of people. That's what we call class consciousness, right? It means you recognize that members of your class group share your interests, and that members of other classes are your antagonist, right? They are your opponent in life. Members of the same class demonstrate their belonging with one another through all kinds of social and cultural projects, right? They form associations, they create music and art that expresses their class identity, they project values and commitments to one another, and this is how a class is born and functions and understands that it is a real thing in the world, right? Let's talk about the working class. What was life like for them? What did it mean to experience life as a member of the English working class during the early Industrial Revolution? One thing I would say is it was a disciplined life. You'll remember when we talked about liberalism a few weeks ago, I talked about how important the idea of discipline was to liberals. Self-discipline, right? You have to train yourself to be independent. And in lieu of self-discipline, liberals believe in various forms of external discipline to make people sort of behave in the industrial economy. So many members of the working class face that external discipline, right? When they go into factories, there are foremen there who use corporal punishment, who use monetary fines, shouting, swearing, any other form of coercion they could find to get people to work hard, to work fast, to work consistently over grueling long days, 12, 14, 16-hour work days. Work and just everyday living conditions were unsanitary. They were dangerous. Said the work days were incredibly long. There was no real break from work. Factories were humid, which meant in the winter they were brutally bitter cold. They were frequently wet. It was not uncommon for workers to be standing in water at some point in their shift. They had to be kept humid. The reason there's so much water around is because the thread would dry out if it wasn't humid, and it could snap. And so factories were constantly kept humid, which just made them extremely uncomfortable. They were poorly insulated. Factories were poorly insulated, so they were freezing cold in the winter. They were unbearably hot in the summer. Let's see here. And then, of course, as you can imagine, the air quality was very poor. And so respiratory diseases were a very common outcome for industrial workers. There's dust, there's particulate in the air, there's no ventilation, right? Ventilation in a factory workspace is a very recent development. They were dangerous, right? Machines were very dangerous. It was not uncommon for someone to have their hair caught in a machine and lose a portion of their scalp, to lose fingers, to lose arms, etc. As I said, there's this, it was very easy to contract respiratory illness. The work was also very monotonous. You read Adam Smith this week, and he was singing the glories of making 48,000 pins in a day as opposed to 20. But one possible consequence of that, and one actually very likely consequence of that, is that work got really boring, right? There's no craft in work. Instead, you're just running the same step over and over and over again for years and years and years, right? And so it's a boring, dangerous, and very uncomfortable life in the factories. Those are Luddites. I should have pulled that slide up before. This is an image that sort of captures the difference between working class people's lives in the 1840s and the elite and the middle class, and how they benefited from workers. Right, so at the bottom here, we see people sort of struggling in, this is a sort of mining situation, but it would apply to a factory as well. And the subtitle to this cartoon was, "It is gratifying to know that though there is such misery in the coal mines, there is a great deal of luxury results from it," right? And so what this cartoon is suggesting is that the middle class and the elite justified all the suffering that I'm talking about by saying, yeah, it's very bad for those people, but they have to understand that we get so much from it, right? Our lives are so much better than they've ever been. And isn't that a benefit? Isn't that a wonderful thing, right? Let's continue. So what else about the lives of the working class? For one, the working class was very young. Working class people did not live long. And it was also very female, right? Women made up 60% of British factory workers in the 1840s. Anywhere that you saw a job that lacked real social status, so unskilled work in factories that paid low wages, you were going to find female workers, right? They were a completely disempowered workforce. They had no choice but to take the absolute worst positions available. Men were much more likely to work in heavy industry, that's steel mills, coal mines, etc. But men were also more likely to have skilled positions. And a skilled position comes with social status, and it also comes with higher pay. Women maintained work demands at home as well, right? So the gender imbalance of domestic work that we all, I'm sure, are familiar with, was a thing in industrial England as well. So even though women might work 16 hours a day in a factory, they still were solely responsible for making meals, for cleaning the home, for raising children, entirely responsible for raising children, which meant that women in industrial England did not stop working. They only worked, right? They slept very short nights, and then they worked constantly. And the result was a lower life expectancy for women. Women died young, and they died frequently. Where did folks live when they weren't working? They lived largely in urban dormitories, right? People didn't necessarily go home to their own houses. These dormitories were cheap. They were hastily constructed. There was no privacy. There was very little comfort to be had. And the neighborhoods that developed around these dorms were known as slums. Slums were usually comprised of housing owned by the factory, which meant that workers would pay rent from their wages back to their bosses. So it was like you earn your wage and then you pay your wage back to your boss, right? It's a pretty exploitive cycle. Um, slums were dark, they were dense, they were very filthy. I'm going to give you some just appalling and astounding statistics here. In Manchester in the 1840s, in the slums, there was one toilet for about every 212 people, right? So you would share your toilet with roughly 200 people every day. And that means that people just aren't really using toilets, right? They're throwing their waste into the streets, or they're throwing their waste out their windows or into the yards or whatever. In one district, there were 33 outhouses for 7,000 people. 7,000 people. As you can imagine, this leads to the spread of a number of diseases. The most famous, of course, is cholera, typhoid fever, these sorts of things that spread through contact with human waste, become endemic, and are another reason that people's life expectancy was so short. This is a grueling, grueling place to live. Here's what Charles Dickens said about London, the London slums. They are places, he wrote, of darkness, dirt, pestilence, obscenity, misery, and early death. This was a violent life. It was a life marked not only by grueling work conditions, but also unsanitary housing, unrelenting economic insecurity, right? If you lost your job, there wasn't going to be any kind of a safety net for you. You would just be out on your own. A life of disease, a life of malnutrition, a life of alcoholism, and a life of drug abuse, drug addiction, particular to opium. In Manchester, the very heart of industrial power, the average age of death in Manchester in the Industrial Revolution was 17 years old. And that was largely due to a high infant mortality rate. 50% of infants did not survive in these conditions. And it was also due to death among young children who were themselves working in the factories, or were contracting disease in the slums. Okay, that's life in industrial England. What do people think about this? What are the politics of this world? The most powerful, the most incisive, the most persistent criticism of industrial conditions came from a new political movement called socialism, right? So we've talked about conservatism, liberalism, and nationalism, and then we've talked a little bit about the politics of romanticism. But now we're going to move into another ism of the 19th century, socialism. What was socialism? This is a term, obviously, we're hearing a lot about right now with the election. It's an incredibly commonly used term. I don't know that it's always a super well understood term. But what did it mean in the 19th century? Basically, socialism was, and it is, a political and economic philosophy that maintains that land and wealth and social goods ought to be owned and regulated by the society as a whole, right? That is in opposition to other political movements that say individuals should own those things, right? So the liberal capitalists would say it is the individual who should control land and wealth and all the social goods. It's also in opposition to the conservatives, right? The conservatives would say that the king, or a small class of the elite, right, the first and second estate, should control the land and the wealth and all the goods, and the rest of the people should be submissive to the elite, right? So we have different approaches to how we think about access to wealth. Socialists say all of the people should control these things together. So socialists talk a lot about property, right? Because they're concerned with the mass of people controlling the property as opposed to individuals. When they talk about property, though, they're not talking necessarily about movable goods. They're not talking about, your shoes. They're not saying all of the people should own your shoes, right? And they're not really your shoes. What they're talking about is something they call the means of production. And this is an incredibly significant term for you to wrap your head around, okay? The means of production are the things that, when manipulated in some way, they generate wealth, they make wealth, right? So what are means of production? They're things like land. Land is the basic one. But they can also be natural resources like coal deposits, right? They can be lines of communication, right? So in our culture today, it would be access to cell towers would be a mean of production. In industrial England, that is telegraph wires, right? It's factories, it's machines, right? The stuff that enables someone to build wealth, to make more stuff. Okay, those are the means of production. Under liberal capitalism, right, under the industrial regime that controls England at this period, there's only a few people who control the means of production. They're very powerful, they're very wealthy, and they're able to concentrate power into a relatively small number of hands. Okay. In the middle of the 19th century, the most persistent, the most prolific voice of socialist politics was Karl Marx. Marx was a German economist. He was a philosopher. He was a historian. A kind of convenient way to think about the two major economic thinkers of this era, Adam Smith, who we're reading this week, and Karl Marx, on the other hand, is to think like this. And this is probably too general, but I think it's helpful. Smith is sort of like the godfather of the discipline of economics. And Marx, also very important contributor to economics, but is sort of like the godfather of the field of history. Okay. If you want to study history, you're going to read a ton of Marx. And if you want to study economics, I don't know if they do read Smith, but you're going to read work that's deeply inspired by Smith. Maybe you find that helpful because they remain really the dominant philosophers of this age in our own time. They're both very valuable to know about still. So Marx was born in a middle-class home. He was born in 1818. He's by far the most important socialist thinker of his age. He's so important that a term is coined, Marxism, that essentially is synonymous with socialist thinking and certainly with communist thinking, right? Marxism is sort of a philosophical way of thinking about how the world is organized that draws on Marx's criticisms of industrial capitalism. There's two main ideas running through Marx's philosophies. Okay, and these are very important for you to at least get a sort of basic handle on. The first idea is materialism. Okay, what is materialism? I've got a kind of helpful little triangle here I found that might be helpful to you. Materialism claims that material reality, right, the concrete facts of everyday life, the stuff of your life, the food you eat, the water you drink, the work you do, the money you hold in your hand, right? These things are the determining factor for social life. Okay, if you want to understand a society, you have to focus on the basic material ways that the society works, right? How does it fuel its machines? How does it feed its workers? Okay, how are its classes organized? Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Most important of all, who controls the means of production, right? Materialism is just, it's like a fancy word for this idea. Everything in the society, religion, culture, politics, social relations, all of those things depend on who controls the means of production. Okay, who controls the stuff that builds wealth in the society. All right, if you want to understand a society, figure out who controls the means of production. This is like a more sophisticated way of saying follow the money. I'm sure you've heard people say that before. If you want to understand a problem, follow the money. This is like a big scaled up version of that. If you want to understand a society, follow the means of production. Right? Marx is arguing that the possibilities of your whole life, right? Your very sense of who you are is going to be determined by your material basis in the society. Okay? Your access to resources, your relative control of the means of production. That's going to be the thing that shapes your whole life. Okay? And then this superstructure develops on top of all of that. And we sometimes confuse the superstructure, our government, our family relationships, our religion, our education. We confuse that for life. But Marx would say, no, that's not life. That's just a consequence of what's really important in life, which is the economic base. Okay, this is kind of a helpful pyramid for illustrating this. Let's take religion as an example here, right? Religion, Marx would argue, was an epiphenomenon, right? It was simply a consequence of more important things, right? It only existed to keep land and power in the hands of those who already had it. The point of religion is to reinforce material social relations, right? It's like a drug, is what he would argue. It clouds the minds of workers. It resigns them to their condition. It keeps them dreaming of a better life, even if that will only come after they die, right? Which means that it suppresses revolution and it protects the capitalists who own the means of production. They'll never have to share that ownership with the working people because their religions have tricked them. And this is Marx's theory. Historians today, for the most part, think this is way too simplistic, and that the reasons people engage with religion are far more complex than this. And I absolutely agree with that. But this is the basis of Marxist theory, so I think it's helpful to illustrate it. This image here, which is actually from 1911, but it sort of captures how Marxists and socialists think about the superstructure, the social relations, right? So as you see at the bottom, we have workers, we have farmers, they're on your right, we feed all. And then you've got industrial workers, we work for all. They're on the far left, and they're holding up the whole society, but they're also crushed by the whole society. You have the bourgeoisie, the middle class, they enjoy a nice, comfortable life. They can get themselves drunk and fat and happy. You see this one guy's got his face smashed into the table here. He's so fat and happy and drunk at the expense of the working people. The police and the military, they exist to murder the farmers and the industrial workers, and to keep them from ever challenging the power structure. The religion, we fool you, right? We trick you into believing that this is reality and that you'll have rewards in the next life. And then you have the capitalist businessmen and the kings, we rule over you. And at the top, you have the means of production hidden away up there, and they are fully in control of them, okay? And so this is the system that exists on top of that most important issue, which is controlling the means of production. All right, so it's pretty complex. I hope you're getting a basic handle on what all of this is. But it's basically just a way of explaining how a society is organized, okay? And this is universal. Marxists would say all societies follow this pattern. The second important theme in Marx's writings is his theory of history. Marx believed that history followed an inevitable path, almost like a scientific law, right? If you could understand the path, you would always be able to predict what was coming in the future. It's like gravity, right? And Marx charted the basic stages of this process, and he said all societies are going to follow this process, and here they are, okay? What you have is primitive communism, sometimes primitive accumulation is how people describe that. This is like people in the wild fending for themselves. There's no classes and there's no conflict, they would argue, right? Then you advance from that into a slave system. And this is, Marx explained ancient Greece and ancient Rome as slave systems, where there's owners and there's slaves. The owners oppress the slaves. That advances into feudalism, right? Which is where all wealth in the society is held in land, and the people who control the land, that's the only mean of production, and the people who control that land are the landowners, and they run the society and they exploit serfs by forcing them to work that land. The French Revolution and other revolutions in the 18th century overthrew feudalism, and they created this new capitalist society, which is where the middle class, the elite members, like of the third estate, they come to control the society. They take over the means of production, and they oppress these workers that we've been talking about, this working class. And the term that Marx used for the working class was the proletariat. Okay. Eventually, that will produce a socialist society. The proletariat will rise up. They will overthrow capitalism, and they will create a worker state, and the state will manage life. But workers are still oppressed under that society, but eventually socialism will mature into a communist society where all people live in sort of perfect harmony with one another. No one exploits anyone else. And that's the Marxist theory of history. Okay. It actually fits in quite well with the way a lot of 19th century utopianists think about history, including very religious utopianists who believe that soon Christ would return to earth, and there would be no more conflict, and a perfect utopia would reign, right? I don't think Marxists would like to hear that necessarily, that that their theory of history is very similar to sort of evangelical Christian theory of history, but it kind of is, actually. There's something utopian about both of them. And the 19th century is a utopian century. People are always thinking about making a perfect world. Okay. How does a society get from one stage to the next? How do you move from primitive accumulation to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, to communism? How does that work, right? Well, the way it happens is through class struggle, right? Warfare between the classes is the thing that breaks the stalemate and leads you to a new phase in history, okay? There's always going to be class struggle, Marx would say. The haves, the people who control the means of production, are always going to be threatened by the have-nots, the people who don't control the means of production. And through these social collisions, these are going to be revolutionary social collisions. Old orders die and new orders are born. Okay. To Marx, the Industrial Revolution was the outcome of just such a collision between the middle class, bourgeoisie, and the nobles and kings across Europe, right, who had controlled land. The middle class destroyed them in a series of revolutions. The French Revolution is just the most famous, right? And they had produced industrial capitalism, and now they had become the exploiters of the working class. Okay, and as you see again, it's the revolution of the people at the bottom against other people on the chart that is going to be the thing that disrupts the society, and brings about a new age, a new era in its history. This is a gloomy picture, right? This is a dark way of thinking about history. But for Marx, the bright side is that while capitalism is doomed to collapse, it will eventually yield a less exploitive system, a better system, right? This is that utopian ideal I'm talking about. Eventually, workers are going to unite. Eventually, workers are going to kill those who exploit them. They will destroy the system that exploits them, and that will produce a world that is less exploitive, a world that is better for workers. This week, we're going to read a bit of the Communist Manifesto, which is where Marx lays out some of these ideas. He laid them out in a much more rigorous theoretical treatment called Capital, which is his sort of masterwork. But the Communist Manifesto does establish most of these key ideas. Marx wrote this with his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, and the manifesto ends with this very famous call that I'm sure you've heard before. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have the world to win, right? Marx has this vision of a workers' utopia. It's just going to follow that next revolution. And this is extremely appealing to workers, and it's extremely appealing to a lot of intellectuals who realize that industrial capitalism has major problems. And it remains extremely appealing throughout the 20th century, and it is one of the most powerful and potent ideas in world history ever. And part of its appeal is romantic, right? It's drawing on romanticism to say you can get in touch with something better. There's something deeper waiting for you. And if you find commonality in one another, not through nation, but through class, you can achieve it, right? You'll make a better version of yourself. You will be less selfish. You will be more humane. You'll be more cooperative. You'll be more creative, right? In future weeks, we're going to dive deep into thinking about the long-term consequences of Marxist thinking and socialist politics. We're going to talk about the extensive human misery and violence that's committed in the name of socialism in the 20th century. But in the mid-19th century, that's still far off, right? These are just big ideas. These are big ideas that are on the table. The work of the 19th century was outlining the socialist critique of industrial capitalism and then beginning to organize workers and intellectuals to support it. Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the year of the revolutions that we talked about last week. In 1864, Marx and his allies formed an organization called the First International Working Men's Association, which is just commonly referred to since as the First International or the Communist International. It's sort of the founding of communism. By 1869, there's 800,000 members of the First International. By the end of the century, this is a worldwide movement. It exists in every country in Europe. It exists throughout the United States. It exists across most of the world. But socialists were divided. The key question that they faced, and it's a key question that I think they still face, is how do you move the class conflict along and achieve that next phase of history? How do you get to the workers' socialist state and then eventually to this more utopian form of communism? There are those who argue they should violently overthrow the middle class, and that's what workers tried to do in Paris in 1848, and they were obviously crushed in the June days. And then they tried again in Paris in 1871 in an episode called the Paris Commune. Workers seized the entire city of Paris and tried to build a workers' community, and they were also crushed by the military. There are others who say, no, I don't think that it's going to be a violent revolution. I think instead what we should do is work through the political structures that exist and get elected, right? Win elections. They say by ballots and not bullets, we will create the socialist state. And they begin trying to pass worker-friendly legislation. They say, instead of trying to start a revolution, let's clean up the slums. Let's make work safer. Let's make work a little easier for people. Let's get people paid more. So by the turn of the 20th century, by 1900, socialism it's a major global political movement. It's at odds with itself. It has a lot of internal conflict. And we are going to pick up that story in the weeks ahead. Okay, thanks everybody for watching, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of this with you.